Hello there, my name is Gavin Walsh and today is Sunday the 16th of October 2025 and this is part 3 in the St. Kevin, the Truth Shell Out files. I'd like to talk to you today about the finances of Aer Lingus in those early days, and we'll go right to the starting point. In 1936, in April 36, when the airline was formally set up, the government injected 100,000 shares at £1 each in capital investment into the airline. That was basically its starting out money. Of course, £100,000 then would be, it's almost immeasurable what it would be against today. But I will come back to this point later as to money then versus money today. Throughout the war years, as I already explained in the last video, it was a skeleton service that was haphazard and run to Liverpool and Manchester, and very, very occasionally before and immediately after the war to Croydon, London. And in that period of time, the airline had to beg off the government £360,000 in subsidies just to stay above water. So again, huge amounts of money for the time was in it. And then of course in 1946, April 5th, 46, the Anglo-Irish Air Agreement was set up between the two governments. Now I've already explained this in the second series, and that saw a huge amount of cash injection from both governments. Upon the setting up of the Anglo-Irish Air Agreement, the capital investment from both governments amounted to a whopping £1 million, which was 10 times what the startup fund had been from the Irish government 10 years previously, excuse me. And this was funded at the basis of 60% from the Irish government and 40% from the British government. And as already explained, the British government's share fell down between two of its own three airlines. That was British Overseas Airways Corporation. They took a 10% hold. And British European Airways, known as BEA, they took a 30% hold, with Aer Lingus under, I believe, Rienta, the holding company, holding the remaining 60%. Alas, that money, that million, was gone in no time, and by the end of the financial year, 1947, which was the end of March, Aer Lingus was again in huge debt for well over £100,000, and again these losses had to be incurred by all three holding companies. And in the case of the British two airlines, aforementioned airlines, BEA and BOAC, because they themselves were making losses at this point, the 40% was eventually handed back to the British Exchequer, as indeed it was to the Irish Exchequer in terms of the 60% Aer Lingus holdings. So this was up to the 1947. Aer Lingus was going into a nosedive in terms of earnings. It was losing money hand over fist. This would also have applied to the British Airlines as well. So they were bleak times, and it was also a time for infrastructure going into the airlines in terms of pilot hirings and staff hirings and aircraft procurements, etc. If the losses of over 130,000 were to be considered substantial, which indeed they were to the end of financial year 1947, that is March 31st, what was to come the following year was momentous. The losses were off the Richter scale, with the Aer Lingus, the National Irish Airline, losing £647,000. That's two-thirds of a million. You must consider that that's a loss in conjunction to the million that was already put into it, added to all the money that was taken in, the turnover of the airline. So the airline was going into dire financial stress, and there was even talk of it being shut down. Things were very, very bleak, and the more conservative, shall we say, of the British establishment, the newspapers, they were screaming for Britain to get out of it. Britain, of course, couldn't get out. They were tied into this AAIA deal from April 1946, so their hands were tied. Plus, the British government needed Shannon to top the tanks to get to America, and this was all part of it. But Britain was losing money hand over fist, thanks to Aer Lingus and its own airlines as well. In addition to all of this, you had the people on this, the Republican side of things, shall we say, or the nationalist side, speaking up in the Dáil and accusing Aer Lingus of being nothing more than a sheep in wolf's clothing. In other words, it was an Anglo-Irish airline, which it was. And so the airline was in dire straits, and politicians in the Dáil, our own Dáil, were asking questions, and conservative politicians were asking even harder questions over across the Irish Sea as to these losses. And it quickly became apparent that that these losses could hardly be stemmed. And a lot of the British media were pointing out the fact that the British Exchequer was taking this huge loss on behalf of a small Irish airline. Now, they also, as I've already said, they also had their own huge losses on their own airlines, but it's one thing having your own loss without covering your neighbour's losses. So you can see from their perspective. Added to all of this, the pilots in Aer Lingus at this point had no permanent contracts. They had no pensions whatsoever. They had no rights, and they could be hired and fired on the spot. And so they were starting to raise concerns. So the Aer Lingus management was caught in a terrible bind between satisfying the Irish government, the media, and of course its own internal staff. And as I say, at the end of 1948, the losses reached a staggering peak, and it simply could not be sustained, these kind of losses. In the financial year from April 1st, 48 to March 31st, 49, the airline went on a massive cost-cutting or cost-slashing measures, and they had the backing of the pilots, and they had the backing of all of the staff, because everyone knew their jobs were on the line. And they cut as and where they could, and they did manage to get the losses down to £168,000, which was still a ginormous loss, but a hell of a lot better than the almost 2/3 the previous year. At this point, the management in Aer Lingus, and I'll specifically name these people in another video, but at this point, the management of Aer Lingus, or rather the executive as they were referred to at the time, they started coming up with another way of saving money, a very, very important way, which is very, very pivotal to our story. And it involved the dispensing of the radio officers. Now, radio officers were effectively navigators, and there was 2 pilots on the DC-3. A captain and a co-pilot are basically 2 pilots who could fly the plane. And in some cases, that would be 2 captains, I should add. But it would basically be 2 fully qualified pilots and a navigator who sat in behind them in his own little station. And he worked out the route and where they were at any given time. And a bright spark in Aer Lingus came up with an idea that they could dispense of this person. Now, this was not happening at any other airline in Europe, but where they got their cue from was it was happening with the largest airline in the world, American Airlines, who indeed are still the largest airline in the world. And they got their cue from them. Now, there was one massive difference. The United States was rolling out VOR stations, which is basically a method where they could pinpoint where a beacon would, or a beam would show up in their cockpit every so many miles and keep them on track. That was fine in the US, especially in the eastern seaboard, where they started rolling these out as early as the late 1930s, but there was no sign of them being rolled out in specifically on any of the Irish routes, or any of the routes that Aer Lingus were flying. But what there were beacons every so many miles along the way, and basically the management thought, the executive came up with this proposal that if the pilots were given a crash course, and that's my own term, by the way, but if they were given a basic heads up on how to do what the radio officers could do, it would satisfy the safety criteria. And on paper, this was fine, believe it or not, but it did have a few drawbacks, which I will go into later, and it would take all of the wrong things to come together for the pilot, no matter how qualified he was, to be basically important in the cockpit in terms of navigation. And but the saving on this was estimated to bring the airline back onto neutral ground, where they wouldn't be losing money. They may not be yet making money, but they wouldn't be losing money. And the pilots were given a stark choice. Now, at this point, the pilots themselves had held a one-day strike over their lack of contract permanency, lack of rights, lack of union rights, and pension was the big one. They had no pension whatsoever. And there was also one, believe it or not, about what would happen in the event of a fatal crash if a pilot was lost, or 2 pilots were lost. So Aer Lingus, the airline itself, did actually suffer its first ever one-day strike. And from then on, both parties, be they the pilots and the executive, started to sit down and talk to each other seriously. Around this time, the Irish Airline Pilots Association was founded, and from that came the International Federation Airline Pilots Association. It's a little known fact that a man called Captain Tommy Handley, or TJ Handley, he was one of the founding members of both of these organizations, and he's going to be hugely reflected in our story as we move into these further into these podcasts. In the summer of 1950, Aer Lingus basically told the staff, or specifically the radio officers and the pilots, basically take it or leave it. All radio officers, we will give them a chance, because the airline was still expanding, even though it was losing money. Routes were slowly expanding and they were adding aircraft. And basically the management told the pilots union at this point, the Irish Airline, IALPA, Irish Airline Pilots Association, they basically told them, look, there's 27 radio officers, and any one of them can become a pilot, subject to them passing all the relevant training courses. Now, some of them just didn't bother; they just took leave and left. Some of them, actually, I think only about 3 of them made the pilot. Now, that's not any disreflection on their ability to. That's just the way it went. I'm sure there were some who didn't make the grade, but the airline then told the radio officers, they had their own union, that by the end of 1950 they would all be literally fired, and that's the term they used, and that was the newspaper headlines at the time: radio officers to be summarily fired on the end of the year 1950. Now, in the meantime, there were some captains who put their head above the parapet, including the aforementioned Captain Tommy Handley, and they pointed out that there were some routes that, if the worst came to the worst, a pilot may not be able to navigate his way out of it, for reasons which I will go into later. And the airline, of course, largely dismissed this, but in order to appease this small band of pilots who were viciously, in fact, fighting this removal of the radio officers, they brought in a unique thing whereby a captain, if he felt he needed it for safety, he could overrule management, he could demand a radio officer, and one would be provided to him. Now, because at this point they had got their the deal had been done on their pensions and their permanency, very few pilots were going to go back and tinker with management. Basically, they had achieved an equilibrium where both sides were content. Tommy Handley negotiated 3 routes that, in his opinion, could not be safely flown without a radio officer, irrespective of how qualified the pilot was in navigational techniques. And the airline accepted this, but accepted it only until September of 1951. And from there on, it was basically take it or leave it. And I've shown in the story that some of the captains, very few, far and few between, did demand and get radio officers on their flight. But all this time, the radio officers were leaving the airline. Now, I should have pointed out there were a handful who took up a job in office in Aer Lingus as office work was expanding. But by and large, by 1951, the radio officers were no more. And as you can now probably figure out, everything was put in place for something, if something went wrong, for it to go catastrophically wrong. By the following year, which was financial year to end of March 1950, the management basically did a deal with IALPA that if the losses could be brought down to 6 figures or under, that is 100,000 or under annual losses, that they would kick off with a superannuation program on behalf of the pilots. But those losses had to come down to 100 or lesser, and they had to continue their downward spiral from there on in. And with this, the majority of the pilots accepted that the radio officers were now going to be a thing of the past, and just get on with things. And so by 1950, as I've already explained, by 1951, all of the radio officers were basically shedded. And again, by September 51, there were no radio officers. Now the savings that came from that are harmonically beautiful and yet very tragically sad. So true to the management's plan of continuing the downward spiral, the losses in end of financial year 1950 were down to about, I believe, £14,000. So over the next 12 months, they eliminated the radio officers. And by the way, the cost of 27 radio officers per annum was £32,000. So by 1951, the profit, the Aer Lingus finally, after 15 years, Aer Lingus had its first profitable year. And the profits that year were almost 17,000. And of course, if you add 17 and 14, you get 31, and the radio officer's loss was 32. So, you know, that was a prophetic or ironic or whatever you want to call it, but it was to prove to have an extraordinarily sad outcome. But on a more personal analysis, for want of a better description, it was to prove to be very sad in that, and this is in my opinion, by the way, in my opinion, the IALP at that point were after the accident, were left up the creek without a paddle, because they couldn't exactly fault the airline for the cutback of the radio officers, and the airline, of course, was never going to fault themselves. And this is the major, not one of, this is probably the prime predicatory factor as to why the cover-up was enacted. Now, I'm not for one instance suggesting IALPA were in on the cutback or in on the cover-up, but members in IALPA knew it was a cover-up, particularly members right up the top. And a lot of the people in it were, a lot of the boys there were company men, and they had got everything they needed, and you know, a plane crashed, and they were that was one of the consequences of it. Again, that's not something I can prove, but with phenomenal levels of circumstantial and coincidental, shall we say, evidence, I'll detail it and outline it for you over the following few podcasts. So, okay. Thank you for watching this one. Oh, and apologies, by the way. I was busy the last 2 weeks. I got tied up, but I'll get back making one of these every week, and we will get the truth out, and we will get everybody named, and we'll get to the bottom of why the St. Kevin airliner has been left in a bog with its captain, a senior Aer Lingus pilot, in its front for the last almost 74 years. The truth will be out. Okay, thank you for watching this. Please share it. As I say, you're all I've got out there, the viewer. Okay, thank you.